Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome a new contributor this week. Ethan Watson is his name. Ethan is, Ethan, actually, I'm going to ask you to tell a little bit about yourself. I've kind of got your bio here from the article we'll be discussing, but since this is our first time meeting you, take a moment, tell us a little bit about who you are and what makes you tick.
Awesome. Well, great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So my name's Ethan. I'm a student at the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk. I'm getting my master's degree in accounting right now. I've got an undergrad degree in political science as well. And then I'm looking to go into law school in the near future. So lots of testing in my future, is what my parents like to keep reminding me of. But I became politically aware, I would say, in 2020. COVID was sort of the impetus for me really getting into politics and following it. Because I could see how public policy was impacting my life, in real time, right? It's like the government issues a decree, and then it's, I can't have prom now. I can't have my graduation. And so that's when I really started thinking about the way public policy is created. And I started debating with my friends and discussing. And a few years later, here I am.
Well, we've got a wonderful article that you've written to discuss, and it's titled, Enough from Experts. This November, voters should think for themselves, to which I first say, amen. It's time. You mentioned, your own awakening kind of coincided with what we saw that came out of the, not so much the pandemic itself, but the pandemic response. And experts, boy, that was, you do what the experts tell you. But it turns out to, with 4 years of hindsight, those experts didn't always do so well. So let's talk a little bit about some of the experts that are trying to shepherd us and our votes in one direction or another.
Right. Yeah. So kind of the re-emergence of this I saw was when we saw that letter by 16 Nobel Prize economists come out right before the Biden-Trump debate about a month ago. And it was, your standard run-of-the-mill 16 economists signed a letter saying that if Trump's elected, he's going to cause inflation, he's irrational, and so that's going to scare the markets or whatever. One of which I will note was actually Janet Yellen's husband, so maybe a little bit of bias going on there, a little bit of expert bias, but that kind of reawakened in me what I'd experienced during COVID, which is that experts were sort of behaving like policymakers and they were the last word on policy or political decisions, when in reality, I think they should be the start of the conversation. So they should give their input and then we should all think about it, and politicians should take into account the multiple expert perspectives, because there's not just economic issues, there's not just public health issues going back to COVID, right? True policy will take place or take into account both aspects, all aspects, and find a happy medium or a compromise. And so I was thinking then that this feels like it should be the start of the conversation, but we shouldn't let this be our end all be all. Oh, the economist said he's going to ruin the economy. Boom, I'm voting for Joe Biden. That's not what an educated voter would do.
Well, it seems like with the experts, there was a period of time, at least during the early part of the pandemic, where we were told, do not do your own thinking, do not do your own research. And that seems like almost a kind of learned dependency that was being encouraged. And I assume that has spilled over into other areas of our lives, particularly politically. We may be vulnerable to that if someone's telling us, don't look too closely into this. You let us tell you what you need to think.
Right. And it was even more than that. It was almost like condescension during COVID, right? It's like if you dared to ask hey, maybe we should also consider our quality of life other than our just material health, but are we living good lives? Are we enjoying our lives? Are we able to run our businesses and see our friends and do all the things that make being healthy worth it? If you even raised that question, you were smeared as some kind of rube. What do you know and how dare you? And really all we wanted was an earnest and good faith explanation. And it felt very condescending as, I was just 18 at the time, but still I thought, I'm a citizen. I can vote. Why can't I ask the question without being told I want to, I don't know, kill grandma or something? That was the line that you kept hearing get thrown around.
Right. And you point out in your article, and I completely agree with this, politicians have a tendency to hide behind experts, right? Because they have the credentials. We really need to do what they say. But a great example of that you point out was, unfortunately, President Trump giving all that deference to Dr. Fauci. And that's probably one of the things that hurt us the most in terms of the pandemic response.
Right. And I find sort of the expert testimony or even just sort of raw statistics hammering each other over the head with that to be a very unconvincing argument for policy. For a couple of reasons. And, I'm going to quote my college roommate, maybe he's going to be out there listening to this somewhere, but we were arguing about something back in 2020, and I had said, well, I have this statistic that proves I'm right. And he says, oh, I'm sure you just went to www.imright.com and found a stat that supports you. And that really resonated with me, right? You can find a statistic that supports just about any position. And most people don't even really understand how statistics can be manipulated or how they can be biased, how there can be errors in it. And so for me, we can argue about, whether this is going to, drop death rates during a pandemic by 2% or whatever. But I'm more interested in the moral and philosophical implications of policy. Is this good? Is this good for people? Is this good for our society? Are we living good lives? And the same applies to areas, whether it be climate change or economics. I'm more interested in hearing the moral argument for something than just here are the numbers. You can't argue with them. Now dissent, or don't dissent, rather.
I love that you referenced too that the way the American founders organized our system of governance, it wasn't dependent upon experts, and there was a reason behind that. Why was it?
Well, it's because, experts, first of all, they're humans like the rest of us, and they're fallible, right? They are subject to the whim, their own personal, agendas. And also because experts are siloed, right? That's like the definition of an expert. If you're an expert in public health, you're probably also not an expert in economics or sociology. I mean, maybe you are, and good for you. But most experts are necessarily siloed in their knowledge. And so they can't see the full view because they've narrowed down on that very specific point. And so I use the example of, COVID, right? So public health officials would say, shut it all down. This is what's best to keep everyone as healthy as possible. Economists would say, keep it all open, right? This is what's best to keep the economy running as smoothly as possible. There's a rub. If you think about climate policy, right, the ecologists would say, regulate emissions heavily, right? Maximum carbon taxes and things like that. But, economists and business experts would say, well, what's best for the businesses is no regulation, right? Very low taxes. And so the truth is always somewhere in that gray area, and politicians exist to find that gray area.
Hear, hear. So let's talk about some of the practical considerations of, it sounds, rather than depending on experts, it sounds like it's more important for us, maybe not so much to become the expert, but to know the right kind of questions to ask to make sure that we're getting a full, broader perspective of what's going on. Anything you recommend in that regard that can help people train themselves to be, inquiring minds, to know how to ask those kinds of questions?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to pull a little bit from my accounting background here. And as an accountant, we're told to have professional skepticism when we're looking at a company's statements, right? So management says they're doing X. We say, okay, respectfully, we think that looks good, but we're still going to check into it, right? That's professional skepticism. So a healthy dose of skepticism with everything you read is key. I'd say also think about what the person who's saying it has to gain from it. So, during the COVID pandemic, public health officials were saying, we need to have all these shutdowns, and we're kind of issuing these decrees. They had a lot to gain from that, right? That concentrated a lot of power into their hands. And so, not saying that it was necessarily wrong, but understanding the motivations and the incentives behind some of the information that you're hearing would be really key as well. Absorbing a variety of news sources, right? So it's super easy to find yourself in like a Twitter echo chamber. It happens to me. It's the algorithm works on all of us, right? But make an effort, flip the channel from CNN to Fox or Fox to CNN or whatever it might be, and just hear what the other side is saying. Can help you also understand kind of where those biases come from and then make your own opinion.
And that's harder to do than it sounds. I mean, people who do it, when you bump into the limits of your own mental universe and realize, oh, I don't really know, that can be painful. But I love that you end, your article with an exhortation to, it's your duty to be the one who has the final say. So it's about shouldering that responsibility instead of trying to outsource it, correct?
Right, exactly. And one final point on this, no matter how you slice it, we're human beings, and we've been imbued with reason and logic, whether you look at it religiously, made in the image of God and all that, or even as people in a democracy, right? We all get a vote. That implies that we all have the brains and the rationality and the logic to make our decisions as well. And so either way, it's a matter of human dignity, I think, to make your own thoughts and opinions. Once again, we are visiting with Ethan Watson. He is a Young Voices contributor. Ethan, where can people find you on social media? Sure, you can find me on X at ERWatson13. That's kind of, I'm trying to grow that platform a little bit. But yeah, I would love to interact with you all on there.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We have another first-time contributor joining us on today's show. But I happen to know this guy, so I'm really excited for a chance to introduce you to Niklas Kleinworth. Niklas, you and I have crossed paths in other areas, but for our audience, this is going to be their first opportunity to meet you. Tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, I'm the policy director for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. I've worked for the Idaho Freedom Foundation for 3 years now, actually, and time has flown by. I started out as an intern here, and it's been a real blast. I specialize in financial policies, so I analyze the state budget. Bitcoin policy kind of falls into that category. Things like central bank digital currencies are also policy issues I focus on. I also pay attention to healthcare policy and things like that. But at a small think tank, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades too.
Well, you're very good at what you do, and I want people to know, I'll brag on Niklas without any hesitation. He's super good at what he does, and that's why I'm very glad to have you talking about this topic of sound money. It seems like my money buys less all the time, and I believe that's a product of it not being sound money. When we talk about sound money, what exactly does that refer to?
So when we're talking about sound money, we're actually talking about money that holds its value over time and protects your financial liberties as well. So what we're finding is as technology advances more and more, and as the government gets bigger and bigger, you're finding that your money is not only buying less than it did only a few years ago, but your financial privacy and your rights to be able to spend that money how you choose are quickly going away.
But fortunately, there are some solutions that are being proposed. And primarily, I think your article talks about some of the things that are happening at the national level, but this comes down to the state level as well. First of all, tell me about, at the national level, what are some of the more promising things regarding sound money that are being proposed?
Yes. So let me just first touch on some of the threats that they're proposing at the national level too. So we're looking at things like central bank digital currencies, which is basically it's crypto for big government is the best way to boil it down. It's a digital currency that allows the federal government to control all of your purchases and monitor how you're spending your money. It has the potential of creating money that can expire and money that can only be spent on certain things that the government deems that you can spend it on. And that's a really huge threat. So far, we've only seen legislation in the House of Representatives, and it's kind of stalled in the Senate under Democrat control right now at the federal level. You're also looking at threats from your own banks too. So we don't have to wait for the threat of central bank digital currency. We're also seeing that where people are losing their bank accounts because they're affiliated with conservative causes. And so some of the solutions to that involve implementing things like Bitcoin or digital assets, allowing which is free market money. So a lot of people are not quite sure what Bitcoin is or what crypto is, but all it really is, it's a digital cash. And Bitcoin in particular, it could even be better described as digital gold. It holds its value, it's inflation, it resists inflation because there's a finite amount of it in the system. And the way that it's verified prevents it from being copied or counterfeited, which helps make sure that you don't lose access to that money. And because it's a private currency, you don't have to worry about the federal government or a banking institution deciding how you get to spend it.
To me, that is one of the biggest things. I know some people, well, if it just exists in the digital realm, it's not real. But the system by which exchanges are made through blockchain technology and the unfalsifiable nature of Bitcoin means you don't need a bank. You don't have to run it through a middleman who either gives you permission or withholds or says you must wait 3 business days before this transaction clears. It can be done wherever the recipient is. It can be done instantly. There's a permanent, unfalsifiable record. And that kind of security, that's worth a lot. Although I can see where the banks might be like, hey, wait a minute. How are we going to make money on this?
Right. Well, and a lot of the banks will probably object to something like Bitcoin just because it does exist outside their scope of control and their ability to manage it. But really, it's a sign of the times, actually. Banks were originally created as a way to safely store your money, and then eventually, with the advent of more technology, became a quick and efficient way for somebody to help you manage your money. So you didn't need to carry wads of cash around in your pocket anymore. You can just allow those transactions to take place in the background simply by sharing some information. And what you have now with Bitcoin is that is all done on a distributed ledger, so you don't have to rely on one institution to do that for you. And it's more the community itself helping make sure that just the transactions are verifiable and that nobody's duplicating anything.
By the way, there is a video out there. I don't know if you have seen this. It's the Tuttle twins explaining Bitcoin. It's maybe 20 minutes long, but it is one of the best illustrated explanations. And I know for a lot of people, it's like, I don't know what this is. If you watch that video, you'll have a very good understanding, good basic understanding of what, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is and isn't. I want to go back to a moment, though, to CBDCs and why that's a place where we need to draw a line. You had mentioned that the difference between Bitcoin and CBDCs is government controls those CBDCs. And with that control, control is the operative word. I mean, how far can they extend themselves into your life to exert influence, if your money is kept in that central bank digital currency?
Quite extensively, actually. There's actually a paper published by the Federal Reserve contemplating what it would look like for a central bank digital currency. And among the things that they were discussing was automatic payments of welfare, automatically deduct taxes, and things like that. If you look at examples of central bank digital currencies used in other countries around the world, China currently has a pilot central bank digital currency. They're testing it out, and it's tied to things like social credit scores and whether or not you're doing things that the government likes. And the surveillance state with the central bank digital currency is to a degree that I think most of us couldn't even fathom.
Well, and people who wonder, well, but could that really be abused? I would just say, think back a couple of years ago to the Canadian Freedom Truckers convoy, and people who even donated money to try to support them found their bank accounts frozen or found the money confiscated or their accounts, shut down. So yeah, it doesn't seem like a good idea to turn that much control over. What are some of the resources people can turn to in terms of learning more about sound money, cryptocurrency, and CBDCs? What sources do you trust, Niklas?
So actually, the Tuttle Twins video is a really great introduction to the Bitcoin ecosystem and how that works and how it actually retains its value. I would say that that's a really good primary resource to go to. Another good resource would be bitcoin.com. Bitcoin.com is kind of where it all started. If you are somebody who is really into understanding the background of how Bitcoin works, there are things like the Bitcoin white paper is posted on there. And you can also go to places like Bitcoin Magazine. You can get the latest articles on what's going on in the ecosystem, and you can understand where the technology is going. And if you're wanting to understand the political landscape of that too, we at the Idaho Freedom Foundation have great resources as well. We have our Sound Money Policy Agenda. That's at idahofreedom.org/Sound Money 2024. And then I also trust the Satoshi Action Fund. The Satoshi Action Fund is a national Bitcoin-focused policy group, and they also have a lot of really great resources and even a glossary on Bitcoin.
Wow. And the good news is, as you're describing there, at the state level, there are some actions being taken here too. I can't wait to have you back on the program so we can talk a little bit more about that. Niklas, for people who want to follow you on social media, where can they find you?
Yes, you can find me on X at @nkleinworth. I'm regularly posting articles and what I'm doing here at the Idaho Freedom Foundation.
Great to visit with you. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me, Brian.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are welcoming another first-time contributor. Harris Van Pate joins us. And Harris, since this is our first time meeting you, I'm going to ask you to just set your modesty aside, take a moment, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Brian. Great to be here. My experience is mostly on the intersection between public policy, politics, and law. We have seen in the last 10 or so years a massive politicization of our legal systems, our courts, and my area of specialty is analyzing the interaction between those two very different fields. I have a law degree from Florida State, and I have 3 to 4 years of experience working at various state-level policy think tanks. I'm currently a legal and public policy analyst at the Maine Policy Institute, and I'm also an adjunct research fellow at the Free State Foundation based in Maryland.
All right, so we know Harris is keeping busy, among other things. Let's talk a little bit about your article here. Should small government libertarians really be excited about Chevron's death? Now, I didn't know much about the Chevron Deference until it was, overturned by the Supreme Court. But my initial reaction was, oh, that feels like a regulatory boot coming off the backs and necks of Americans. But I say that without knowing a whole lot about it. Is there more that we should be taking into consideration when it comes to the overturning of that deference?
It definitely isn't a simple issue, Brian. I would say that we should be happy. Anyone who cares about lifting off the burden of bureaucracy and burdensome government should be happy about Chevron's repeal. The Chevron doctrine, in simplified terms, was a 40-year-old doctrine where courts had to give some level of deference to administrative agencies when it comes to reviewing their interpretations of law. The original court case was decided in 1984, so almost exactly 40 years ago, where the Supreme Court was reviewing a EPA interpretation of the Clean Air Act, deciding whether they should show deference to the EPA's interpretation of what a source of pollution was. And at that time, they said, the EPA, they're the experts, they're a bunch of environmental attorneys, let's listen to them, they're the experts. But over the next 40 years, the court would continually have to walk back that deference. They would have to reduce it in some significant way because they kept continually seeing the administrative state, because they're part of the executive branch, continually pushing and pushing and pushing for greater and greater power in that area. And that's where the most recent case where it was repealed, Loper-Bright, came in.
So I know this is asking for a very general answer to a complicated question, but is it a net benefit to have a smaller regulatory footprint, or are we shooting ourselves in the foot by making it a little more difficult for those regulatory agencies to do what they do?
Making it harder for regulatory agencies to regulate private conduct unchecked, making it that harder is a good thing. And we have to remember, a lot of these people, they're unelected bureaucrats. They aren't really responsive directly to public opinion. And we saw in the Loper-Bright case, for example, we had the National Marine Fisheries Service place a very, very burdensome regulation on boat owners, where they would have to pay for their own federal monitors, which was absolutely nonsensical. But because they argued in court, Chevron deference, you Supreme Court should have to listen to our interpretation of this law, it became very, very burdensome. So it is generally good that this doctrine has been repealed, but it's not necessarily something where we should all say, okay, the war is over against burdensome government. Because historically, especially if we look at a very, very old American history, we can see many cases of where judicial overreach pre-Chevron occurred. And we have to keep in mind that this case did very much put the court system at the central focus point of when regulatory agencies can interfere in general.
And does that put the court in a position that it's maybe not fully qualified to be in?
Very arguably. Now, the court in this most recent case said the issue here is a statutory legal interpretation. So in a way, courts are have the most expertise in this area. But on the other hand, if it's a very, very specialized area of law, that might not necessarily be true. My big concern is that if we look at very old cases like Dred Scott, where the U.S. Supreme Court said several years before the Civil War that Black Americans aren't entitled to American citizenship, that's very concerning, because in this case, this most recent case overturning Chevron, the court essentially confirmed that they're the final authority of interpreting law. But in certain points in history, there have been Supreme Court cases that were outright wrong. Everyone would agree that Black Americans are American citizens. They're Americans. And Abraham Lincoln, when he went into office, was at this very hard juxtaposition where he had to decide to agree with the court in that situation, and or not. And he decided eventually not to. He said every branch of government has their own right to interpret the Constitution differently and has a moral obligation to enforce their own interpretation. And whether or not that's true, it certainly does bring a different lens looking at this most recent overturn of Chevron, because while it reminds me a bit of if you've ever seen the movie Megamind, where the bad guy Titan says, "You're not free anymore. It's more like you're under new management," and that very well, we have a very arguably pro-liberty court right now, but things change, especially with President Biden debating an 18-year term limit for justices. Things can change quite quickly even in the Supreme Court, which is a pretty slow-moving body. So this is good, but this isn't a perfect solution to the problem. It's movement in the right direction is what I would say.
Okay. We're down to just a couple of minutes left. For people who want to get their minds around the this Chevron decision without having to go to law school, is there a good resource where they can get a good basic understanding of this? It seems like the more I dig into it, the more I realize, wow, there is a lot of depth and a lot of nuance that I really hadn't anticipated.
Well, I have an article on this very subject going up on the website freethepeople.com. It should be going up soon. And I intend to discuss this issue more on my Twitter account as well, which can be found at Harris_Van Pate. And this is definitely an evolving issue. We very well might see if there are, dependent on how the court goes, there might be a reinstitution of the Chevron doctrine. There might be a reestablishment of more precedents. This is an evolving issue for sure, but it's also a very important one.
So Harris, I have to ask you, on the whole, are you more encouraged or discouraged by this decision?
I am encouraged. I'm happy that this happened, but I think that there is more movement that can be made. I think that this decision really confirms that agencies don't have this massive amount of power to interpret law, but it is concerning that the court really struck against a lot of concepts of the branches being equal competitors for power and keeping themselves in check. So I would say I'm happy, but this is definitely a complex issue. I'm not absolutely happy. I'm not as happy as can be. I'd say 8 out of 10 on the happiness scale.
That's good to know, though, because I know some people are treating it like a slam dunk, and what I hear you saying is maybe not a slam dunk, but perhaps a bit of movement in the right direction. I just want to see more clear delineation between, look, these are the lawmaking people, these are the administrative or executive people, and kind of keep those lines clear. But once again, for people who want to follow you on social media, where can they find you, Harris?
I can be found on Twitter at Harris_Van Pate. And I also have a LinkedIn page with the same name.
Very good. Wonderful talking with you. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you. Me too.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. And we are happy to welcome another new contributor to the program. I'm glad to introduce you to Iulia Lupse. Iulia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So we know that you are a Young Voices contributor, but I'm going to ask you to fill in a few blanks for us and tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I've worked in the news media and in politics for basically my whole adult life, joining Fox News right out of college. And this past year, I transitioned to freelancing full-time. Right now, I'm working with a few local and state level candidates, as well as other clients, helping them with their communication and writing needs. And during my free time, I'm continuing to learn, analyze, and write about the world, and hopefully contributing to meaningful discussions and debates.
Well, we didn't start with an especially easy topic, but I love that you have taken the time to write about Trump's unconventional approach might be the key to ending the Ukraine war. I know that this is something that's on some people's radar screens, but sometimes it's easy to forget what is going on in Ukraine. Talk to me a little bit about how does Trump's approach differ from that of the current administration when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia situation?
Yeah, so I think it's important to start off by talking about the real human cost to the war in Ukraine. I actually studied abroad in St. Petersburg back in college, so I was very fortunate to make friends on both sides. And I've been talking to them a little bit over the past few years, which really opened my eyes to what's really going on the ground. And I think that there's a growing sentiment here, but also in Ukraine as well, of them just being tired and demoralized by the war. It's led to significant casualties with thousands of military and civilians' lives lost. Many of the people who have died are working age men on both sides. And this has been a huge blow to Ukraine's future workforce and economy. And on top of that, we have to consider the impact on us, especially in economic terms. We've provided about, or more than at this point, $53 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. And this is a massive expenditure that comes at a time when Americans are facing their own economic challenges, including inflation, budget constraints, rising costs of living. So many people are starting to question why so much money is being spent overseas when there are many pressing issues here at home that need our attention. And that's why in my article, I argue that Trump's unconventional approach might resonate more with Americans because it promises a swift resolution. His strategy focuses more on direct negotiations and leveraging personal relationships, which, although unconventional, have proven effective in the past. Take, for example, his efforts with NATO in terms of defense spending, the Abraham Accords, his historic meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, which were all significant achievements. I think that he has a more decisive approach that would prioritize the interests of the American people.
I appreciate your take on this. You know, I've followed this since, particularly I've followed it like most people since February of 2022, when really this became, headline news for most of the world. But I have to say, I'm never sure if I'm getting straight information. There's a great deal of propaganda, and again, this is coming from all sides, and this is a very politicized conflict, which further muddies the waters. And so it's very hard for me, just as a bystander, to pin down, okay, who's right and who's wrong, because this doesn't seem as black and white as some would try to portray it.
Yeah, definitely not. And also, I think that it seems like I think that our media here and generally in the West has been laser focused on basically just painting this as Russia's evil, Putin must be stopped at all costs. And while this all may be true, they're just the same old talking points. While there's a growing sentiment in America, sort of fatigue with what many see as these forever wars. People are just tired of prolonged conflicts that seem to have no clear end in sight, and they're looking for for solutions that prioritize our interests and address our domestic needs. For example, polling data also shows this, or has shown this over the last couple of months, and even going as far back as last year. There's a shift in American public opinion regarding the war in Ukraine. A Gallup poll from November 2023, for example, shows that a pretty large portion of Americans, driven mostly by Republicans and independents at 62% and 44%, that think the U.S. is doing too much to support Ukraine. Another more recent poll found that nearly 70% of Americans want the Biden administration to push Ukraine towards a negotiated peace with Russia. And this support remained high even when respondents were told that negotiations might involve Ukraine making concessions to Russia. And just yesterday, I actually saw the Pew Research Center came out with a poll that shows that the share of Americans who see Russia's invasion as a major threat to U.S. interest has declined significantly, with only 34% saying it poses a major threat to our national interests, down from 50% shortly after the invasion. And now, according to the same survey, over 50% of Americans in general also say that they're extremely or very concerned that the war will continue for many years. And I think this really indicates a growing fatigue with this prolonged conflict and a desire just to prioritize American interests.
I appreciate, too, that you're making it clear. It's not a matter of indifference to the suffering that is going on there, but it's a matter of, the continued aid has the potential to just simply prolong this indefinitely, and I can see where that would be intolerable. Talk to me about Donald Trump. You mentioned in your article that when he first was elected, there was a lot of skepticism about whether his foreign policy would be worth anything. What does the record show? Was he actually pretty savvy when it came to his foreign policy capabilities?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, I definitely think he was, and there are several reasons why I think that, and why I also think he would be better positioned to stop the war in Ukraine. And I think the first and most important one is that he's actually expressed a willingness to do so. I think his emphasis on reducing U.S. involvement in what he calls endless wars resonates with many Americans. But in general, I just think that his somewhat different and at times controversial approach to foreign policy has worked. He has a history of using somewhat unconventional methods to achieve results like engaging directly with foreign leaders. And I think this approach could be particularly effective with both Putin and Zelensky. But I just keep thinking back to the Abraham Accords, for example. They were considered nearly impossible. Now, I think it's fair game to assess the degree to which they were successful, but I think they demonstrated an ability to navigate complex geopolitical landscapes and bring together parties with deep-seated historical conflicts, which would be invaluable in negotiating a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, two countries with a very long and complicated history.
Yeah, I'll admit, when Trump was first elected, I was not a fan as far as I thought the guy's all talk, he's all bluster, but I was actually kind of surprised to see that he was pretty capable when it came to promising something and then following through on it. Why is it in your opinion? Why is it in the Biden administration's interest to continue providing aid and to continue, in a sense, it looks like fight a proxy war against Russia, with Ukraine as the battleground?
So I think it's probably because Biden from the get-go said that we will, continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But this has kind of backfired, especially seeing what's going on in the country right now. People are kind of starting to ask questions. Why are we sending billions of dollars to Ukraine when, we have problems here at home? But I just think he kind of put himself into a corner a little bit by just, sending money over, no questions asked. And I think because this is problematic because it only will prolong it and more lives will be lost.
Again, we are talking with Iulia Lupse. Iulia, for people who want to follow you on social media, where can they find you?
So you can find me on X at Iulia L 27.
Very good.
Yeah, that's usually where I am.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much as well.